Overland Park, Kansas, a park-like community with a special quality of life.
Today, Overland Park, Kansas is projected as the third largest city in Kansas, with more than 130,000 people. When William B. Strang, Jr. came to this area 90 years earlier in 1905, it was all farmland. Strang was a visionary who saw a city where others only saw pasture and cropland. This was 80th and Santa Fe as Strang first saw it. 22 years after the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, the United States government moved the Native American Shawnee Indians to land west of Missouri by treaties in 1825 and 28 on a reservation of 1,600,000 acres, which became Johnson, Douglas, and parts of Shawnee, Miami, and Franklin counties. Fort Leavenworth and Fort Scott were established, and troops patrolled the border along the old trail that became the Military Road, today known as Metcalf Avenue. Religious people founded missions just inside the territory, the first being the Shawnee Indian Methodist Mission in 1829. Reverend Thomas Johnson and his family and helpers ran the mission and were the only white settlers allowed on this land. Other missions were set up by the Quakers and Baptists. By treaty with the U.S. government in 1854 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act approving this treaty, most of the American Indians in this territory were moved from the large reservation to Oklahoma Territory. But the Shawnee's Native Americans were allowed to live at large on a newly located Black Bob Reservation of 200,000 acres. Or the Indians could select a tract of 200 acres for each member of an Indian family. Charles Blue Jacket, a Native American Shawnee, chose land for his family north of Old Shawnee Town. Blue Jacket was born in Michigan in 1817, educated in Ohio, and was moved with other Shawnees to the Kansas Territory. Blue Jacket was known for his unblemished character, dignified appearance, clear common sense, and was one of the best counselors of the Shawnee Indians. He was elected as chief of the Shawnees and was a commander of a company of Shawnees in Colonel Alexander Johnson's Civil War regiment. He became a Methodist minister who preached to the Indians and whites and was a prosperous farmer.
On Indian Creek, just west of the Military Highway, a fine farm was established, and William Perry Phillips built a large farmhouse. This farm was acquired by John P. James in the late 1800s. The farmhouse was enlarged by auctioneer Andy James, and today is occupied by a James descendant. Henry Coppock first came to Johnson County in 1857, bought 60,000 fruit trees, and became the first nurseryman in Kansas. He bought the farm of his Native American friend, Graham Rogers, and stayed as a Johnson County resident the rest of his life. This farm was on the west side of the Military Highway, Metcalf, and ran from 65th south to 71st, west to Antioch. Jacob Marty came with his family from Wisconsin in 1865 and bought a good portion of the land selected by Indian Red or Rad Carpenter. This land was west of the Military Highway from 71st south to 75th. Jacob Marty and his son John Marty built the house seen here about 1900.
1874 atlas shows a Glen post office on the east side of Metcalf, just a little north of 79th Street. It was the focal point of what became known as the Glen community. The post office was started in 1868 and operated out of the home of John and Sarah Henderson. By 1910, the post office was located in the A.M. Wood Building in downtown Overland Park on the southwest corner of 80th and Foster Street. It moved several times, and in 1961, the post office was built at the southwest corner of Concert Street and 80th Street, where it is located today. The Antioch Cumberland Presbyterian Church was first organized in 1871 and built the first wooden frame church in 1873 at 75th and Antioch. This congregation continued until 1911, when this church combined with the Corinth Cumberland Presbyterian Church from 83rd and Mission Road. Both churches closed and formed the Overland Park Presbyterian Church. The membership met in homes at first, then the concert building, until the stone church was built in 1913 on Overland Park Boulevard, south of 81st Street. In 1929, the congregation built a larger church with classrooms on the northeast corner of 81st and Overland Park Boulevard.
Strang was born in 1857 in Ohio. He started in the railroad business at the age of 15, working with his father. Strang had built railroads all over the world and this country, and was living at this time in New York City on Park Avenue with his wife, Margaret. Strang wanted to build a flood-free community and selected the high, fertile land where the military highway crossed the Santa Fe Trail from Westport, today known as 79th and Metcalf. He purchased 600 acres, parts of several farms. C.O. Proctor's farmhouse, which was located where the Santa Fe Commons high-rise is today, was moved to a lot in Strang's new platted subdivision of Overland Heights. William Strang moved here with his wife Margaret in 1907 and lived in the Proctor home while his new house was being built on the southwest corner of 80th and Marty. The Strangs lived in this new home until Mr. Strang's death in 1921, and Mrs. Strang continued to live here until her death in 1927. This home was torn down in the late 1940s. Mr. and Mrs. Strang are buried in this mausoleum in the Lenexa Catholic Cemetery. Strang ordered the land to be surveyed to start building the interurban Strang line, grading the railroad bed, laying oak ties, and 70-pound rails in the fall of 1905. He completed the track from Lenexa through Overland Park to 41st and State Line, Kansas City, Missouri, in the spring of 1906. The first official run on May 20, 1906, took 28 minutes from Lenexa to 41st Street and State Line, and 23 minutes coming back this same route. It cost 7.5 cents each way. William B. Strang Jr. made railroad history when he picked up his first car, named the Ogarita, for one of Strang's nieces, from the J.G. Brill Company, a division of Pullman in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in April 1906. His car was the forerunner for our modern diesel locomotive. Notice, no overhead trolley. The second railroad car Strang ordered from the J.G. Brill Company was named the Marguerite, for Strang's wife, Margaret. This car was in service by August 31st, 1906. It was 62 feet long, heavier than the Ogarita, and was equipped to haul freight and passengers. William B. Strang Jr. and other Strang Line dignitaries welcomed the third car, the Geraldine, named for Strang's niece in Overland Park in early 1907. The most sophisticated car of the Strang's first 4 cars was the Irene, again named for a niece. Irene arrived early in 1908 and was the most luxurious car with wicker and plush seating in a drawing room atmosphere.
Strang was building the Overland Park station at the time the line was opened. It was lighted with gas, a real showplace at night. It contained the ticket office, waiting room, and Strang's personal office. Pictured here inside this station, Strang is at the desk on the left, and his brother Robert is believed to be the man on the right. In August of 1906, Strang platted the subdivisions of Overland Park, Overland Lots, Overland Heights, Overland Hill, and Overland View. He was an early developer to impose building restrictions for his subdivisions, requiring $1,000 residence in Overland Park, $1,500 in Overland Hill, $2,500 in Overland Heights, and $1,000 in Overland View. In September 1906, Strang conducted the first auction of lots in the new town of Overland Park. These auctions were handled by Thomas Riley as vice president of the Strang Land Company. These auctions were gala affairs with refreshments served and one free lot in a drawing. Strang constructed a stone building which would become the first retail business in the new community. This stone store became a grocery store, confectionery, tobacco shop, and office for the Strang Land Company. By 1910, Strang convinced Grant Conser to move the one retail business in the Glen community, Conser's General Store, to the Strang town site. This first Conser building can be seen behind the stone store as a wood frame lap siding building. It is believed the wood frame building burned in the 1910s and was replaced with this two-story brick building housing the dry goods store on the first floor, a meeting hall, offices, and apartments on the second floor. Kettles ran the dry goods store for years, and the post office was located here for many years, run by the Moreland sisters. Today, we know it as the Dragon Inn. A.M. Wood came from La Hart, Kansas to this community in 1908 and started a real estate and insurance business. 2 years later, Strang convinced Wood to build a frame and stucco building at the southwest corner of 80th and Foster. This building served as Wood's office, a grocery store, a toy and stationery supply store, with dentist offices and rooms on the second floor.
Now Strang's Overland Park was growing. Leonidas Cave, one of the first conductors on the Strang line, built a house of concrete blocks which were made by hand with a machine, house plans and supplies, all of which could be purchased from the Sears Roebuck catalog. This two-story house stood many years until torn down for development in the 1950s. Lon Cave, as he was called, was elected Sheriff of Johnson County in 1910 for 2 terms. When he left public office, he came back to Overland Park and opened a new hardware store, which he sold to Frank Sheppers, shown standing in the door next to the Model T truck. In 1906, Strang built a stone building to house and maintain his railroad cars. The first building was 60 feet wide by 100 feet long. In 1908, Strang ran a pipeline from gas wells on his land to this building and installed 2 50,000-watt Buckeye electric generators shown here and converted the Strang line to an overhead electric trolley line at a cost of $800,000. Leo Davis, on the far right, was one of the electrical engineers for the Strang line at the car barn with the electrical maintenance crew. One of the other chief electrical engineers was Tom Lynn on the far right, in front of the Buckeye generators. Tom Lynn built his own house diagonally across 79th Street from the Strang car barn on the south side, a 2-story late Victorian house. He built other houses in Overland Park for residents and business people prior to 1921.
In 1910, the Overland Park State Bank was chartered and built this building, which served the bank well for years, including the Depression years, until the larger building at 80th and Metcalf was completed in 1955 and serves Overland Park's banking needs as part of the larger UMB national banking system. Strang built waiting stations along his line to protect his riders from bad weather. He located these stations close to country schools, towns, and subdivisions. The Southridge station was larger than most. The Milburn station also housed the Strang Land Company office when Strang was developing the Milburn subdivision, well before the Milburn Country Club was founded. Ticket offices for the Strang line were located in special stations, such as this Lenexa station. At the time he was building his Overland Park station, he built a dance pavilion he called Santa Fe Trail Hall. First, it was located west of the rail tracks, just north of 80th in what is today the center and east lane of Santa Fe Street. By 1908-09, Strang moved this hall east across the tracks, and by 1911 had torn this hall down and moved the Maple Spring dance floor to the new, larger pavilion in Aviation Park. This new pavilion had a large veranda around three sides with windows that raised into the ceiling, a large stage with scenery space above, movie screens, dressing rooms, and spotting towers for air activities. An extensive playground was built on the east side for the children. This pavilion was built in Aviation Park, an 80-acre area Strang created including South Killarney Lake, now known as South Lake, at 87th and Foster, with tents for weekend patrons to stay overnight. He installed a baseball diamond and built one grandstand at first. By 1914, Strang had 4 more grandstands around the north end of the airfield. Strang is reported to have brought 20 to 25,000 people to Aviation Park on many weekends for camping, hunting, fishing, swimming, crap shooting, dancing, movies, stage productions, and, most of all, air shows. Balloonists, parachutists, and especially the new Wright brothers' invention, aerial planes, performed at Aviation Park almost every weekend. Airplanes in the 1910s were the equivalent of an entertainment activity like Worlds of Fun today. This is a Wright brothers Model B. Charles Hamilton flew a plane like this, the first plane he built west of the Mississippi from his farm at St. Joseph, Missouri. At Strang's urging, Hamilton took the plane apart, shipped the plane on railroad to Strang's car barn, where it was reassembled, and Strang advertised the first public flight of an airplane from a field east of the Strang car barn in 1908. The record for attaining 500 feet above the ground was set right here in Overland Park in 1909. Planes like this Curtiss Pusher in the early days of flying could fly about 10 minutes with the fuel they were carrying at a maximum speed of 45 to 50 miles an hour.
The Stone Building, the first retail building in Overland Park, burned and was rebuilt as the Voight's Building, a 2-story structure with drugstore, soda fountain, a grocery store on the ground level, dentist office, and apartments above. This building burned in 1927 and was rebuilt as a 1-story building, used today as a picture frame shop and an interior design shop. At the north end of this building was a 1-story barber shop operated by Earl Turner for years, now a law office. With thousands of people coming to Overland Park on weekends, many would bring a picnic lunch, but others needed a place to eat. After the Santa Fe Trail Hall, east of the Strang tracks, was torn down, a restaurant was built at this location. It was operated by Jim Hillican, who always kept an extra table open for Strang and his guests. Agriculture was well served by the Strang line pioneering hauling of less than carload lots of freight. The Marguerite was converted to a freight car in 1908. This car hauled packages, milk and truck farm produce, and boxed goods, as well as sacked grain. This car also shuttled regular grain cars, coal cars, and other freight cars along the route. such as the coal cars seen behind the family with their new Ford. In the 1930s, the Strang line purchased some trucks and pioneered home and store pickup and delivery of freight. The freight business generally kept the Strang line operating in the 1930s, as the passenger business was dropping off, even with lower ticket prices to reflect the depression. The freight trucks continued to run until the very end of the Strang line, even continuing some deliveries after the last Strang rail car run on July 25, 1940.
Schools are important. One of the schools serving this area dates back to the Civil War era, 1865. It was known as Pleasant Prairie School, later District 38. The first school buildings were wood frames, such as this one built in 1873 at 85th and Grant, after the district voted to a bond of $1,500. In 1909, Strang gave land to the school district and a stone building was built at Santa Fe and Robinson. This building burned in 1920 and a new brick building was constructed. The district bonded for $40,000 and built a 3-story structure, including a needed high school on the 3rd floor with auditorium, manual training rooms, and kitchen on the ground floor. After many expansions, including a new elementary school across Santa Fe, the 1920s school was remodeled in 1967. The other school serving the area was the John Marty School, District 61. This school was organized in 1868. Bonds totaling $1,000 were voted, and the frame building was constructed on land donated by Jacob Marty at 75th and Lowell. A new school was erected in 1909 at a cost of $1,600 at 75th and Lowell. A one-room school with a basement, entrance halls, and cloakrooms. The name was changed to Antioch School in 1932. A new modern school was built in 1950 at 73rd and Lowell with 4 classrooms, kitchen, janitor closet, and principal's office. Rooms were added almost every year in the 1950s, and additions continued into the 1960s, with the last addition in 1969, when the school became part of Shawnee Mission's School District 512, now known as East Antioch School. One of the activities being promoted in Overland Park today is movie production. In the middle 1910s, Strang built the Aviation Park office, which served as park headquarters. In 1916, this office became the headquarters for a movie production company. Strang had hoped Overland Park, Kansas would become the universal city of the movie industry. He produced one movie and started another, which was never completed. The Hodges Brothers Lumber Company of Olathe located a new lumber yard in Overland Park in the early 1910s. Here is seen the lumber yard located at Santa Fe Trail and 81st Street. This lumber yard was moved to 79th and Santa Fe during the 1940s, where it continued to the early 1980s.
In 1917, sports-minded citizens of this area founded Milburn Golf Course and Country Club, named for the Milburn family, who owned much of the land purchased for the club. The first clubhouse was in the basement of the Milburn Strang station. Then a clubhouse was built and enlarged until the fine facilities were completed serving the club members today. The Overland Park Masonic Lodge 436 was chartered March 1, 1923, and leased Concerts Hall for meetings. Finally, the lodge was able to purchase the first stone church from the Presbyterians in 1930. With enormous hardship, the lodge survived the Great Depression and continues strong today at this location. In 1924, Kansas City Power and Light Company moved its Kansas division from Wyandotte County to Overland Park. They opened a 26 by 100-foot building on the west side of Santa Fe between 79th and 80th in October of that year. By 1926, the Kansas division had 76 employees and was growing. Finally, in 1961, the office and activity was moved to the enlarged yards and buildings at 87th and Neiman. Kansas City Power and Light may have been one of the biggest employers in Johnson County in the 1920s and 30s. Only Johnson County government or the Hire Boot Company of Olathe may have had more employees. Their trucks and crews served a large area south of the Kansas River, west to Lawrence. The Kansas City Power and Light Company neon sign on top of the Overland Park building could be seen from 75th and State Line and was the bright landmark. Herbert Ford, a contractor, came to Overland Park in 1922 and was involved with the construction of many schools, churches, houses, and commercial buildings in Overland Park and surrounding areas. On February 11, 1925, the Strang car barn burned during the night. The cars of the Strang line housed in the barn burned, but 2 Strang cars at Olathe and 1 other car outside the barn were not destroyed. And with these 3 cars and leased cars from the Kansas City streetcar system, the Strang line maintained its complete schedule that day and continued the line with a new generation of cars purchased from American Car Company of St. Louis, Missouri, a division of J.G. Brill Company of Philadelphia. These were all new steel cars painted red to harmonize with the other Strang cars.
In 1923, Mr. L.B. Coles bought the Aviation Park Pavilion building from Mrs. Strang and installed milling machines on the Maple Spring dance floor. The mill was sold to Lenexa interests, who in 1926 sold the mill to the R.W. Jennings family. The Jennings family continued to operate as a feed and coal business until the building burned early in 1943. The main agricultural activity around the Overland Park community was dairy farming. In 1940, there were 285 licensed dairies able to sell milk in Kansas City, Missouri. Over 1/2 of these dairies were in Johnson County. An aerial view of the Porter Dairy Farm at 91st and Antioch shows the barns and support buildings for such a dairy. The Porter Dairy Barn had an exceptional tongue and groove floor for the haymow, which was often used for dances. The Wood brothers, Kirk and Frank, had one of the largest dairy farms in the area, located at 79th Street between Knoll and Lamar. They had 7 milking hens, 7 home delivery routes, and 2 brothers with office and farm help, probably supporting more than 20 families. The Wood sold out to the Country Club Dairy, one of the principal Kansas City milk processors and distributors, which merged into Fairmount Foods. The Country Club Dairy bought the Holmes Guernsey farm where Overland Park City Hall is today and made this into their show dairy. World War II caused most of the dairies to close when the male employees and dairy family sons were called to the war effort, and gas and tire rationing made this business difficult or impossible. Dairying had been the major economic force of the area in the 1920s and 30s. During the 1920s, as well as into the 30s and 40s, the Overland Park School enjoyed an especially fine reputation. Many students rode the Strang line to get to this school, even though they lived in other districts. Mabel Harrison, seen here in the black dress in the middle row, second from right, served as principal for the best part of 2 generations. In 1932, Royce and Wilbur Hogue rented the Charles Pinkham House and started the Hogue Funeral Home. This house was purchased, and all available porches and areas were closed in as the business grew. Finally, a new funeral home was built in 1966 at the same location, which has been expanded and enlarged. This business became part of the McGilley National Funeral Home system. In about 1936-37, Henry Harpool started a children's rodeo group called the Santa Fe Trail Riders. This was a group of young people from ages 8 through 18 years. There were about 35 kids in the group along with the parents. In the wintertime, individuals would practice roping in Porter's Dairy barn loft. This group operated until World War II started. J.W. Stoker on the right went on to national rodeo fame. Bobby Cox on the left did more trick riding events than many of the others, and did you ever see such intensity as Betty England showed starting to roam and ride 2 ponies. Herb Ford built many of the 22 service stations between 75th and 83rd on Metcalf, such as this Skelly station at 79th and Metcalf in about 1937, and Frank Shepard's Standard Station at 83rd and Metcalf in 1953.
Overland Park has been blessed with many churches, beginning with the Presbyterian Church previously mentioned. The Baptists started a congregation in 1914, and after a time built the ground floor of their church building at the southwest corner of 80th and Concert, which was used for classrooms for a time when the Overland Park School burned in 1920. The main church was built in 1929, and facilities were expanded, and the congregation combined with the Valley View Baptist Church and became the First Baptist Church of Overland Park, moving to 96th and Hadley in 1967. The Methodist Church formed a congregation in 1923 in this area. Their first church was built in the Tower Grove subdivision, located at 64th and Floyd in 1924. New quarters were started at 64th and Santa Fe as St. Mark's Methodist Church in 1950. The First Church of Christ Scientists formed a congregation in Overland Park in 1923. In 1941, the first real church was built for this congregation at 7821 Marty. During 1934, the Church of God, Assemblies of God congregation was started with meetings in the Masonic Lodge until September 1935, when a building on the northeast corner of 81st and Lowell was purchased. The church moved to 75th and Lowell in 1957. The Church of God Holiness first started holding prayer meetings in the dormitory of the Kansas City Bible College at 74th and Metcalf in 1942. The congregation finally built a church on the school campus, dedicating this church in 1961. The Catholics of the area had gone to Lenexa for church for more than 70 years. In 1944, the Catholic bishop selected a tree-filled tract at the southeast corner of 71st and Metcalf, where the first building housed the church upstairs and the school for grades 1 through 8 on the ground level. The large church was built on the Metcalf corner of the land in 1962. The Lutheran Church formed a congregation in Overland Park, first meeting in the Overland Park grade school, until their first chapel was built in 1951. This chapel was surrounded by a much larger church and supporting buildings in 1971. Almost at the same time, in 1950, the Christian Church started a congregation. They first leased space in the Dickinson Theater on 80th Street in Overland Park. In 1953, the first church of this congregation was built at the northwest corner of 75th and Concert, which is much enlarged today.
The fire department was organized about the year 1919. The first fire equipment was a Model T truck such as this modified with two 45-gallon chemical water tanks, some hose, a ladder, and a few tools. The department was made up entirely of volunteer members. In 1940, a new fire truck was purchased, and in 1942-43, a large station was built at 7936 Foster. The department and the community were most proud of the dedicated volunteers. At the time of Strang Line's last run, July 25, 1940, John Breyfogle joined his two nephews, George and Louis Breyfogle Jr., to form the Breyfogle Development Partnership. They particularly developed subdivisions and housing that returning veterans from World War II could afford to buy with as little as $50 down. They bought the Strang Line Overland Park station and used this as their office for some years, then moving to a two-story house on 80th Street, where the Red Cross office is today. The partnership bought some of the Strang right-of-way. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Breyfogles built commercial buildings and stores on this land, which they leased to grocery, hardware, sporting goods, Ben Franklin, shoe, and other stores, promoting more business in this bustling community of Overland Park. As the Breyfogles eased out of the housing development, A.C. Langworthy came into this residential development. He developed the Marty Farm, part of which had been the Garistana Farms and other residential subdivisions and housing in the area. By the 1960s, many other real estate developers saw the quality of life here in Overland Park and continued its housing and commercial development. Walt Fleming was the manager of the Kansas City Power and Light Company Kansas Division in Overland Park from 1926 until 1960. In the 1930s, he built several commercial buildings on the south side of 80th Street, just east of the Overland Park Bank. One-story buildings and a two-story building, which housed the post office on the ground floor in the 40s, and the draft board and stamp ration office were on the second floor, as well as the Mission Township offices. Chris Segner and wife Emma had started a grocery store on the southwest corner of 75th and Metcalf in 1926 and operated this store until 1945. Chris Segner loved sports, especially baseball. He managed many baseball teams and established baseball fields. The baseball field best remembered by most people, a 20-acre tract at 87th and Grant, known as Segner Field. Segner built this field with two baseball diamonds in 1944, including a concession stand and ultimately lights for the field. When Chris Segner died in 1950, Emma continued to manage the field until her death in 1955. Then the Johnson County 3-2 Baseball Club took over. The Dwight Coles Post 370 of the American Legion was named for the first young man in the Overland Park community to give his life in World War I. This post was founded in 1922 and sponsored a carnival every July 4th at the Legion Hut and vacant lot on the west side of Santa Fe between the tire store, the Kansas City Power and Light Company, now the Appliance and Swim Quick stores. The Legion also sponsored a girls' twirling corps. In 1953, the Legion moved from the hut to a new building west of Santa Fe Street on 75th Street, where the John Marty home had been located.
The Mission Valley Hunt Club would have a Farmers' Day every May to thank the farmers for letting the Hunt Club members hunt their farms in the fall and winter. This was held at Natziger Polo Field and Hunt Club at the southwest corner of 87th and Row. The events sponsored were the Farmers Horse Race, a mule race, polo games, horse jumping contests, and all the barbecue and beverages you could handle. The state of Kansas passed special legislation in 1940 to establish the Mission Township, including all unincorporated areas of this township. The county sheriff's office policed the area, but the township maintained the roads and streets. The old Hodges lumber yard served as the township garage for a few years until it burned in 1943. The first township board consisted of 3 men, William Laird, Herbert Ford Sr., and Earl Radcliffe. Legislation changed the township board name and responsibilities in 1951. The name became the Mission Urban Township Board and took on responsibilities for public safety and road and street maintenance. The Mission Urban Township Board met upstairs over the post office, and the membership was increased to 5 members: Matt Ross, John Barkley, Harold Horn, Lloyd Rourke, and Robert Knapp. The police department was started. Ben Castile was the first chief until April 1955, when John Kenyon was appointed chief. He served until October 1971, when Myron Scaife became chief. The department headquartered in the township office at first, but quickly outgrew this, using rented houses for several years until larger City Hall offices were available in the 60s and 70s. Finally, a new Justice Center and public safety offices were built across Antioch from City Hall. In the early 1950s, 80th and Santa Fe was the business center for the community. Now bus lines had replaced the interurban, and 6 grocery stores served the area, as well as every other then conceivably appropriate retail business.
By 1960, the area of Overland Park was the subject of special legislation in the Kansas legislature to incorporate as a first-class city the only city in the state of Kansas to be incorporated as a first-class city. The Urban Township Board members served as the governing body until a new mayor and 10 city councilmen could be elected. The election was in August, and Mayor Roy Owens and new councilmen were sworn in September 1960. The 10 councilmen were Herb Ford, Harry Burkhart, Robert Worley, Donald Epp, Don Sloan, Matt Ross, Russell Rees, John Myers, Harold Reed, and Clarence Cast. First-class cities had to have 25,000 residents. Overland Park had 28,000. The quality of life, dedicated government, and hard-working citizens have propelled Overland Park into the 3rd largest city in Kansas at this time. We must all learn from the past and strive to work together to maintain and continue to build our park-like community with a special quality of life for many generations to come.